Due to the graphic nature of the personal accounts and content discussed in this podcast, listener discretion is advised. Many episodes will include graphic personal accounts and discussions of child sexual assault, domestic violence, physical abuse, rape, sexual situations, and suicide.
It was worth it. If anyone wants to know, it was worth it. Let me reap what I sow.
Hello, welcome today to the Latter-day Survivors. I'm your host, Sarah Haley. We also have Christina on the call. Our guest is Taylor Sundberg. We're excited to have her. She reached out to us via our website and Facebook a while back, and we're excited to hear her story. So Taylor, if you want to take it away, we'll just hand it right over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Taylor Sundberg. I'm from Southern California, born and raised here. I am nervous. Let me say that first. This is nerve-wracking for me. I think it's nerve-wracking for anyone to talk about their story. So I just wanted to, throw that out there. I am nervous. And if you're nervous when you're telling your story, just know I was as well. So I figured I'd start with a little bit of background. My grandparents converted to the LDS church after they were married. They had 3 daughters when they converted. So all of my mother and aunts were raised in the church. My grandfather was a bishop, and their entire life obviously was church related. Of my mom's 3 sisters, one married a Catholic, but they raised their sons in the church. They all served missions, temple marriages. My mom's other sister was a temple marriage, and all their kids were raised in the church. And my mom married my dad, who was not religious at all. So I'm one of 5 children, the middle child, and when we were born, we weren't taken to church because my mom became inactive when she married my dad.
Okay.
I think I was 10 and my older sister was 13 when my mom started taking us to church. And that was our first introduction. We did the missionary lessons and we were baptized at 10 and 13. However, after our baptism, my family had a falling out with the church, so we never actually went. We were baptized, we had taken the lessons, but then we didn't go to church. It kind of just faded. And then I was a teenager, maybe 14, 15. And I just felt like I wanted to start going to church. And of course, the Mormon church was the one that I chose because my extended family was Mormon. And I was technically already a member, although I had never really gone. So I started attending on my own as a teenager. Something unique about me is I actually graduated high school right when I was 16, about a year and a half early, because I did independent study and I was at home. So when the time that I was going back to church and getting re-involved was right around my graduation from high school. So they suggested I go to the singles ward. And I was very adamant that I knew the singles ward was to kind of date and get married. And I was very adamant that, I'm only like 15 and a half. I don't think that's really the place for me. They're all 18 to 30. I'd feel much more comfortable in a family ward. But they were very adamant that now that I'm graduated, God wants me to get married and have a family. So I needed to be in the singles ward. And that's what I did. And I was probably the youngest ever possible person in a singles ward, which was uncomfortable at first.
That would be.
Yeah. It was different. It was fun. And I liked it more than a family ward because I always felt like at a singles ward, we're all choosing to be here. Whereas in a family ward, a lot of the kids are forced to go.
Yeah.
So that was a pro. Because I was kind of like a new member or becoming active again, I had a meeting with the bishop my first week in the singles ward. And he stressed that I needed to date. And he stressed that I needed to date a member of the ward. And I said to him, I'm the only one that's 16 here. These guys are all 18. I'm not comfortable with that. And he was very much like, it's okay. All of these guys are worthy. They're all, great Mormon LDS men, return missionaries, yada, yada. So at this point, I was slated to go to BYU. I'd accepted I think a nearly full ride scholarship to BYU. I had turned down a lot of other scholarships to other colleges at that point. So in my discussion with the bishop, he said, I'm going to talk to you in a few weeks. We'll have another meeting. And I want you to be able to tell me that you went on a date with a member, basically. So after that meeting, I kind of made up my own way around it. I was like, okay, I'm not going to go on a date with a member of my ward because they're old, but I will go on a date with someone. And then when he asks, I can say, yeah, I went on a date, kind of my own way around it. So I ended up going on a date with a member that I knew from a different ward. So when I met with the bishop again, I told him, yeah, I did it. We're good. Went on the date. He stressed that I needed to continue dating, etc. And that seems like an offshoot, but it really plays into the way that my story unfolds. I had a male friend that a female friend introduced me to, and we hung out a few times. He was not a member of the church, and he asked me to prom, and I made it very clear that I was not interested in dating him, but if he wanted to go as friends, I was good with going to prom with him as a friend. I just didn't really feel like I wanted to date someone at that point. And he seemed good with it. He was like, yeah, good, we'll go as friends. The next time he came to hang out, we hung out at my house. We were going to watch a movie, and he tried to kiss me. And I said, oh, remember, we're just going to prom as friends type thing. And this is where the assault happened. My parents had actually just run out to pick my sister up from somewhere. So we were downstairs watching a movie in like our movie room. He tried to kiss me a couple more times, and I was like, no, stop. I don't want to. And he said, why? And this part really sticks out in my mind. And I said, because I said so, like, don't want to. And he said, that's not a good enough reason for me.
Oh, jeez.
And that's when he proceeded to rape me. At one point, my parents came home on the upstairs floor, and the dog started going crazy, and that kind of gave me an opening because he kind of was like, what is that? And I rolled out and ran upstairs. And then we run into my mom, and my mom's like, oh, is he leaving? And I was like, yeah, he's good, he's going. And she was like, do you need a ride home? And I was like, no, he doesn't need a ride home. And he was like, yes, could you please? So we had to get in the car, drive him home. The whole time my mom's making conversation about prom. So afterwards, we were obviously friends on Facebook. He texted me and said, send me a picture of your dress so I can match my tie. And I was like, is he serious? Like, he still thinks I'm going to prom with him? So I messaged him back, and I was like, we are not going to prom. Don't contact me. This is not okay, whatever. Yeah. Sent it, and he wrote back, I'm very hurt.
He's hurt.
And then he posted on Facebook a picture, a meme. And I actually found out he posted this before he came to my house. So it was planned. He had posted a meme with a wolf, and it said, if she puts you in the friend zone, put her in the rape zone.
Seriously?
So he came to my house planning to assault me. Yes.
Wow.
And I was devastated. Obviously, I just started going to church where they very much stress purity, et cetera, et cetera. So the first thing I thought to do was, well, I'll go talk to my bishop and he'll help me. He'll do something to help me cope. And I told him, and I showed him the meme that the guy had posted that said, if she puts you in the friend zone, put her in rape zone. And my reason for showing it was kind of so he didn't think it's he said, she said, maybe she got carried away and regrets it. I wanted him to know, like, no, this was assault, and he is even admitting it. And first he said that I couldn't take sacrament for 6 months, that it was a slap in the face to God.
So he's punishing you.
Yeah, exactly.
When it wasn't your fault at all, and you went to him for help.
Yeah, I think he assumed, because he said, don't tell me who it was, don't tell me. He assumed it was the member that I had said I was going on a date with. Because remember, I had talked to him and told him, oh yeah, I went on a date, I'm going to see the guy again. And he thought it was a member of the ward because that was what he had told me to do. So he's thinking he's protecting a member of our ward, which he should have been thinking, who is it, so we can protect the women from him. He wasn't.
Right.
He asked me very, very explicit questions. Did I scream? Did I fight? Was I penetrated? Did I climax? And I'm going, why does that matter? Yes, I fought. No, I didn't climax. But even if I did, why does that matter?
Yeah.
Like, these are not valid questions. And then he told me that the situation is to stay between me, him, and God, and that I shouldn't tell my parents. I shouldn't tell the authorities. And if I did tell my parents, the authorities, or anyone except me, him, and God, that he would rescind my ecclesiastical endorsement and I would lose my scholarship to BYU. So when I had turned down a scholarship to Pepperdine, I turned down a scholarship to UCLA, I turned down all these other scholarships to go to my church school. And now I had no other option. It was I stay quiet and go, or my parents pay a lot of money for me to go to college somewhere that I already was offered a scholarship to and turned it down.
Yeah.
At the time, I didn't realize how bad what he told me was. I was raised with my grandparents, always the bishop and the church and what they say is right, and he speaks for God. And I was very much, this is what God wants me to do. This is what I need to do. And this is how God wants it. So I, didn't take sacrament for a long time. And as I'm sure you guys know, everyone else knows when you're not taking sacrament. So it's very much, oh, what'd she do?
Yeah, it's a public shaming.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't even tell my friends. So in my mind, if I told anyone, I was going against God. So my friend that introduced me to this guy, I'm worried about her now, like her safety, but I can't tell her. And when I told all my friends we're not going to prom anymore, the week before prom, they all were, that's so unfair that you're not going with him now. He already bought the tickets, but I couldn't tell them why. So now I'm the bad guy. I lost all my friends because he was very popular and they thought I just ditched him a week before prom. And I couldn't tell anyone. So that was obviously difficult. In the meeting with the bishop, all of the it was still a sexual sin. It was very obvious in his mind I had sinned. I was impure. So I got super depressed, obviously, for both reasons, both because I was raped and because I now felt like I slapped God in the face, as he had said I did. And he brought up the fact that I could be forgiven. Yes, God could forgive me. And that's great. But then if I ever did it again, God would remember the first time it happened. And each time consecutively that we sin, it's harder for God to forgive us.
Jeez.
I was like, okay, so if I ever sin again, if I cuss or if I lie, whatever, he's going to remember this too, which is a bigger sin. And it's going to kind of be brought up and I'll have to be forgiven is kind of the theory. So that was difficult.
That's awful.
Yeah. And as I said, I got very depressed. I became suicidal. I never acted on it, but I wanted to. And so I didn't tell anyone. And I went to BYU and I didn't last long there, but I went, and that was a very interesting experience for me. I was very young.
Yeah. How old were you were you 16 yet when you went to BYU?
I was 16 when I went to BYU.
That's still very young.
Yeah, lived on my own. I didn't even live in the dorms. I lived in off campus housing. My roommate was never there. She split time, so I literally had an apartment to myself.
At 16.
And
Wow.
it was lonely, but I mean, I did it. I went to school. I got good grades. And about a semester in, I ended up transferring home. I missed my family. Honestly, I was young. I'd never been away from home, and I missed my family. But while I was there, I had a conversation with my bishop in that ward. And he had told me, well, I noticed you're not taking sacrament. Why aren't you taking sacrament? And I said, well, I can't tell you. And he was like, what do you mean you can't tell me? And I said, well, my last bishop said I couldn't tell anyone. And he was like, well, I'm a bishop too, so it's okay. If one bishop knows, you can tell another bishop. Maybe he just meant don't tell anyone else. I was like, he was pretty adamant, but like, okay, I'll tell you. So I explained it. And he never said that what the other bishop did was wrong. He made a point that sticks out. He said, I'm a bishop at a college, so it's a little different. If I had those high standards, no one would take sacrament.
Oh, geez.
So I didn't know if to take it like that many people are having sex, or like, have you met that many girls that are assaulted? Are you saying that this happens that often, that you know of that many cases where if you would tell the raped women not to take sacrament, you wouldn't have any worthy women? That's a red flag.
Huge.
Even if it's just people having sex, why is it that one bishop gets to have super high standards and one is like, oh, it's okay, it happens, you're a college student, it happens? So he told me that I could start taking sacrament again. But then when I moved home, it was the other bishop again, and he was very adamant that the other bishop was wrong, and now I needed to go 6 more months without sacrament. So it's like they contradict each other. And I think he was kind of afraid, like, I told her not to tell anyone. She did tell another bishop. She might be comfortable to tell someone else. So let's throw a little more punishment on her to prevent her from telling anyone else.
Wow.
Which I didn't even know till years later that their mandated reporters, they legally had to report it because I was underage and it was an assault, and they didn't report it. So that was interesting because I didn't even know that at the time.
Yeah.
That they're supposed to tell the police. I had no idea. And I remember at this point, I was still, like I said, I didn't realize what happened to me was wrong. I realized that like the rape was wrong, but I didn't realize that the aftermath was wrong. I very much believed that it was my fault and that I'd sinned and that it was somehow in some way on me. And then I was very still much like firmly believing in the church. I remember having a conversation with someone I knew that had gotten married in the temple. And I was just curious about it. And I said, oh, what was it like? She was like, oh, it was great, yada, yada, yada. And I said, I heard you have to make some kind of promises. What are those? And we were walking. She stopped walking. She turned towards me, looked me dead in the eye, and I will never forget this. She said, if you knew what I had to promise, you would never ask me that question, and walked away. I got goosebumps and I thought, what the heck? I'm just curious. But it's because she had to swear on her children and children's children that she wouldn't speak about it. And I didn't know any of that. My mom obviously wasn't married in the temple, so she didn't know. So the kind of unraveling, for me at least, ended up when I was at home and someone that was with me at BYU, this was probably 6 months later, posted a video, and I didn't know what it was, but I watched it. She was my neighbor at BYU. And the whole time I'm watching this video, I feel sick to my stomach. My hair is standing up. It doesn't feel right. And I very much felt God tell me this isn't of me. I kept thinking, it seems evil. It seems occult like. It seems like a cult. Like, what am I watching? What is this? And why is she posting it? So the video ends and I read what she wrote about it. And it said it was the LDS temple ceremony. And I about died. My entire life in that moment crumbled. I could not believe it. I couldn't believe what I'd watched, what they had said. And I just sat there. Honestly, my first thought was, God's going to strike me down because I'm not supposed to see this. You're not supposed to know until you go. And now he's going to strike me down because I accidentally saw it, which doesn't even make sense now looking back. Like, why would he punish me for something I didn't even mean to do? But regardless, it completely, flipped my entire world. So then obviously I started researching, like, is this true? Is this what really happens? And as I'm sure you know, the more you look, the more you find.
Oh, yeah.
And it just, one thing leads to another. From, like, I had no idea that they believe they can become gods of their own planets. I didn't know that. The missionaries don't tell you that. That was not talked about. So I'm finding all this out and I'm like, this just doesn't this seems nothing like the religion that I was in. Their actual beliefs seem totally different from what the missionary lessons are. They don't add up. So
Yeah.
that was a long, big unraveling of all of that. And I remember when I was at BYU, I met a man, a return missionary, and we were friends. We had a similar class, and this shocked me. He told me that on his mission, he would leave his companion, he would go to strip clubs, and he would go out drinking, and that he actually ended up sleeping with an investigator who
Wow.
was 15.
While on his mission.
So he raped her because he was 20 and she was 15.
Yeah.
And they found out, and they did not send him home.
They didn't?
They just had him repent and had him say sorry. He got to finish out his mission and was released with honors, or whatever they say, and was a full, returned missionary the correct way. And I was honestly dumbfounded in that moment that the rapist was not punished in that situation, but in mine, that was like my first kind of little glimpse into maybe things aren't right, because he admitted to statutory rape and he wasn't punished. And I gave proof that I was raped and I was punished.
Yeah.
But again, the brainwashing is so strong. As I'm sure you know, the minute you see you just stuff it, red flag in a closet.
Oh, yeah.
Put it on your shelf and hope it never comes back to light. Just
Yes.
like my conversation with my friend where she said, if you knew what I had to promise, you'd never ask me that. It was, again, red flag, stuffed it in my closet, hoped it never came back to light. Just little things like that.
Yeah.
That slowly build until one day it's too much and the shelf breaks and your whole world is changed.
Right. You're so right about the brainwashing, and like, it breaks my heart for you that you went to your bishop for help after you were assaulted, and then he turns around and punishes you, and like you knew that you had been wronged, that you had been raped, and you went to the person that was supposed to be a safe person for you. And that's definitely part of what's so dangerous within the church. First off, we talk about leadership roulette. Like, it all depends on what bishop you get, how if you're going to be punished or if you're going to get help. And then, you turn to him and you trust him completely because you think that he has a direct line to God.
Exactly.
And he punishes you. So you believe, that brainwashing is so strong. You believe that it actually is like, that's what God wants. Like, oh, I did actually do something wrong. This was my fault. And it just multiplies that assault to where you're victimized again. You have your spiritual abuse, your emotional abuse, all on top of the sexual abuse. And that's just awful. I'm so sorry you went through that. Like, oh, that breaks my heart for you. And it happens. This is why it's so important for people to tell their stories, because it happens. Like you mentioned in your college, like, are that many women getting assaulted that, no one would be taking the sacrament? And yeah, that's probably the case. That's awful.
I knew another girl at BYU who was assaulted, and she told the bishop, and the bishop said, because she, was planning on turning him in, and he told her, you can turn him in, but the honor code comes for you too. So you technically still had sex outside of marriage. So if you turn him in, he'll probably be expelled, but so will you. So she didn't, because a lot of people don't know, if you're expelled from BYU, those credits don't transfer.
Yeah.
You're done. You have to start over somewhere new. Completely.
That's awesome.
So she had to keep going to school with her rapist, because if she turned him in, technically it doesn't matter if you were forced, you still broke the law of chastity as well. So you're out too. But then I had things like my roommate. They full on came and searched my apartment because she used alcohol to cook. She cooked with alcohol, and it was a big thing, like a big thing. They interviewed all the neighbors. They interviewed me. Have you ever seen her drink it? No, she just cooks with it. Like, she wants to be a chef, so she cooks with alcohol. but yet rape is like, let's just sweep it under the rug and pretend it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So that was, shocking as well. And it took years. It honestly took a long time. So I met my now husband a month before I left for BYU. I met him, and then, I missed my family and him while I was gone. And he was raised Christian. His dad was a pastor, and at first his parents did not like that he was dating me because I was Mormon, and I didn't really understand that. I was like, we pretty much believe the same things. It's just we have the Book of Mormon too, which you should have. I didn't get, because I didn't know what they knew. I didn't know we believed we could become gods. I didn't know we believed all of these other things that they knew because they were outside looking in and they had studied it. So when I was at BYU, I had a patriarchal blessing, and it said that I would marry a worthy return missionary in the temple, yada, yada, yada. So I was convinced that I was going to convert my husband to Mormonism. He was my boyfriend at the time, but I was convinced.
Yep.
Because that's what God said was going to happen.
Yeah.
And I loved him at this point, So he agreed to go through the missionary lessons with me. And I thought, yes, I got him. He's in. But what was so interesting is while we went through the lessons, he knew exactly what he was doing. He took them so that he could point out what he believed that was different. So we would read something and I'd say, so this is what we believe. And he would say, oh, that's interesting. Why do you believe that? And I'd say, well, I don't know, because it says to believe, like, I don't know, because the prophet said, or because, the Book of Mormon says. And he'd say, okay, well, this is what I believe. And I'd say, well, why do you believe that? And he'd say, because the Bible says, and he would point me right to where it said it in the Bible.
Yeah.
And slowly I started thinking, if the Bible says it and we read the Bible, how are we not getting the same conclusions from the same Bible? How is it so different? And I started to slowly learn that it was interpretation. And there are things that I can read that are point blank in the Bible that the Mormon church is kind of twisting to fit their narrative or what they want you to believe. And I'm a born again Christian now, so I have nothing against people that are LDS. I think they are victims. All of them are victims. Maybe some, the people at the top that know, like the prophet, etc. Maybe not so much, but that your everyday average LDS people, most are kind, generous, moral people that are trying to do good and trying to live right. My grandparents were great people. My family, they're all great. All of the LDS members of my family are amazing, and I love them. I hold nothing against them. I hold my unkind feelings against the institution. And again, I have nothing against people that leave the LDS church and are atheist or aren't Christian. I know it's very rare. I think it's like only 2% of ex-Mormons actually become Christian and
Yeah.
still believe in God or any other religion because of the religious abuse. And I know there are problems in every religion, and even Christians aren't perfect. But I found a lot of relief in what I found in the Bible. The first time I ever really realized, wow, this isn't my fault. This isn't on me, was when my husband explained the forgiveness thing. That's not how it works. Like, when God forgives you, he forgives you.
Right.
If you sin again, he doesn't remember your old sins. He forgives you again. That's why he died on the cross, so that we don't have to do all these things the Mormon church says we do, the temple and the tithing and the XYZ.
Yeah.
So for me, I found a lot of safety and love and relief in Christianity and the Bible. But I understand that a lot of LDS people that leave the LDS church don't find that in Christianity, and that's okay too. I think everyone's path with religion is kind of their own, and I feel like there are so many religions that are, this is the only way to be a good person. You have to believe what we say to be a good person. And I don't believe that. I think that there are good people in every religion, great people in every single religion, and there are bad people in every single religion too.
Yeah.
The problem comes when those bad people are protected by an institution over and over and over again, like the LDS, instead of kind of being like, we need to do something about this. It's just, how much more can we hide this?
Right. That's one thing that I always said was, like, when I was in the church, and I would get frustrated with the culture of the church, or, some of the people in the church, the leaders or my parents or whatever would always tell me, well, the gospel's perfect, the people are not, you know?
Yeah.
And that was like my slow unraveling of my testimony within the church was always based on that. And as I saw the culture, and especially like the culture within Utah, which I'm in Ohio, so I'm not in Utah, but I have spent time in Utah, and it's crazy how much worse the church culture is in Utah, which is supposedly supposed to have the best Mormons. And I always was like, oh, well, it's the people making the culture that way. The gospel's perfect, the people are not, blah, blah, blah. Well, then it was when I realized it was the church creating that culture, and it was the church creating those toxic people. It was the gospel that was supposedly the perfect,
Exactly.
what was creating these toxic people. And I concluded, like, the people are perfect, the gospel is not. And you're right, like, so often the church wants to make a good face, and often we do that. Or I know when I was within the church, I wanted to appear like I didn't have any problems, or I wanted to appear like, I lived all the commandments and all that stuff, whereas behind closed doors it's not like that. The church wants to put on a good face and appear good, and so through doing that, they often cover up abuse, or they cover up, they protect the bad people, and at the expense of the people that are just trying to do the right things, at the expense of people that are being assaulted and going to their bishops like they're supposed to. And the bishop's supposed to protect them, or supposed to help them, supposed to report, and they don't, different things like that. It's so hard.
I think about it. I think, what did I expect him to do? Right? Like, what did I want him to do? Maybe tell me it's okay, that it wasn't my fault, that I could tell my parents, that I could tell the police, that he would help me. Do you want me to sit with you while you tell your parents? Do you want me to come to the police with you? Even just, do you need me to get you in touch with a therapist?
Right.
Even just the bare minimum of, it wasn't your fault, you didn't do anything wrong, would have been great. I don't know exactly what I was looking for at the time, but I just heard my whole life, when something goes wrong, if you ever need help, call the church, call the bishop, they'll help. And I remember I didn't talk about it for years, until I'd completely left the church. And then I slowly started talking about it. And just to my husband, I told my husband, and he was mortified, and obviously instantly, like, it wasn't your fault. That's not how it should have gone down. Like, he's the first one that really told me, like, they blackmailed you. Like,
yeah,
that's blackmail. That's not just, and that had never crossed my mind. And of course, at first you're a little bit defensive, like, no, they wouldn't do that. That's not what it was. It wasn't really like that, but it absolutely was like that. That's exactly what it was. And then I remember eventually, I told my mom, and something that she ended up mentioning was, well, my dad never would have done that. I know my dad, and I know people went to him with problems, and he just wasn't that way. And I told her, Mom, I know that. I know Grandpa. He was a great man. He was a great bishop. And the people in his ward were the lucky ones. I don't think that they all would have done the same thing. I don't. I think there are some that would have handled it differently. But the problem is, when you have the people that are giving them those jobs or those placements, let it be okay that some of them are doing it. That creates this culture of it's okay, instead of picking them out and saying, okay, you're no longer going to be a bishop because this was not the right way to handle it. I totally forgot this until now, but I even met with the stake president about it. And he as well said that he would revoke my ecclesiastical endorsement. That's the one who signs it, the stake president. And they actually said, so when I told them what happened, it was around prom, so like the end of the school year. I didn't go to BYU in the fall. I went to BYU in the winter. And they had told me if you were going in the fall, we wouldn't let you. We would rescind your endorsement and cancel your scholarship. But since you're not going till the winter, we'll leave it in place because you have time to repent and be punished. So if I had been going in September, I wouldn't have had enough time to be punished enough to have then been forgiven to be able to go. But since I was going in January, you have 6 months where you, or however long, where you can be punished and repent and let God forgive you.
Yeah.
When there was nothing for me to even be forgiven for.
No. Yeah, you did nothing
It's
wrong.
just so weird. And I want to make a point to say my story is not unique. My story is not the outlier. I didn't know that until I left the church and I started talking about it. And I've met so many people who have the same, if not worse, stories. And I think a lot of people that are still in the church or maybe are on the fence hear a story like mine and they think, okay, well, that's the outlier. That's the 1 in a million, doesn't really happen. No, mine is sadly the common. It is common. The outlier is a woman who, may have gone to my grandpa and he would have gotten her help. And even then, I tried to explain to my mom, my grandpa was a great person. But that pressure, if the people above him in the church, the ones he thinks also have a direct line to God, are pressuring him to cover it up, that pressure can do a lot, even if you are a great person.
Yeah.
Honestly, in my heart, do I think the bishop did a bad thing? Yes, I think he blackmailed me and that was wrong. But I also feel for him in a way because he was raised in this culture with this pressure. Let's say he had reported it to the authorities. They probably would have come down on him very hard. Now he's in trouble. Now he didn't follow God. So it's kind of this thing where, does it make him a bad person? No. Did he make a bad decision? Yes. But it's all the culture of the church from way up higher, from the prophet all the way down.
Yeah.
I didn't get this book, but I know a lot of people when they were raped, they give them the book by President Kimball.
Yeah, The Miracle of Forgiveness.
Yeah, that basically says it's better to be killed. It's better to give up and let them kill you than to survive with your purity gone.
Yeah.
Honestly, if they would have given me that, it would have pushed me over the edge. I probably would have killed myself because it would have been basically saying you shouldn't be alive because your purity's gone.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that book has so much blood on its hands. Because
Mm-hmm.
I actually remember reading that, which I was, sexually assaulted as a child and as a teenager, by multiple different guys throughout my lifetime. And I was an older teenager when I read that. And I clearly remember sitting there thinking like, I didn't fight because I was a child, I didn't know to fight. And I'm like, because I didn't fight, I did something wrong, and
Mm-hmm.
it basically says that you should fight to your death. You should defend your purity to your death. And I felt like I did something wrong because I didn't fight.
I want to say, well, that's obviously, as you know now, not the case.
Right.
And research and the science shows that most women in those situations where they're about to be assaulted, they often do not fight.
Yeah,
because it's subconsciously trying to save their life.
Yeah, they freeze.
They know they're in danger. If you fight, they may kill you. I didn't get into the nitty gritty details of my assault, but basically, when he came over to my house, he showed me, he was like, oh, look at this knife I got. And he flipped it out and it was a switchblade. And then he used that to threaten me. And I mean, I said no and I kicked, but could I have fought harder? Probably, but he also had a knife. So it's like,
Right.
I was in the same situation. I think even subconsciously at that point, I knew, even if my religion didn't teach it and I hadn't thought about it, I think I knew that rape doesn't necessarily take anything from you. It didn't take my virginity. I have to give that.
Right.
And virginity is a social construct anyway. So I knew subconsciously it was better to have that happen than to have something worse happen. So to me, it makes sense why women don't fight, because they're trying to save their lives. Lives are more important than so-called construct of purity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on something you said. You said, you kind of asked, could I have fought a little more? Yeah, probably. I want to acknowledge that probably you couldn't, because I don't ever want a victim to ever even have that idea in their head. Because as you said, in situations like that, sometimes the brain completely shuts down in an act of self-preservation, such that even if you wanted to, there's a possibility you may not have been able to fight any harder. And nobody has the right to ask you to do that.
No, that's a great point.
Nobody has the right to make that assumption about anybody else. And I just want to make sure you understand that if you didn't fight back, maybe you couldn't have, even if you wanted to, because your brain, as you said, was saving your life, You also, if I could touch on a couple other things, you said it was possible that you may have killed yourself. I just want to say, I'm glad you're still here. I'm glad that you saw through that. When you were talking about, you kind of felt bad for bishops, there's a part of me that actually does as well, because these people are indoctrinated too from the time that they're little, such that then they get into positions like this, and all of a sudden, it is the ultimate dilemma of, do I do what God wants me to do, or do I do what I know is right? And I feel like this is the universal internal war that so many of us have had in religion, in Mormonism, and in whatever it is that you're arguing internally with yourself. Is there's so often people say, I knew this wasn't right, or I knew I should have done XYZ, but I felt like God wanted me to do something else. And it's an impossible situation to be put in. It's awful all the way around for everybody involved.
Exactly.
Yeah. I also wanted to, if I could go back really quick and touch on something. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think a lot of people, like, I'll get into it a little bit, but I was working with a lawyer for a while about the open lawsuit against the church. And he just kept saying, I don't get why you don't want to go hard after the bishop. Like, he blackmailed you. He was bad. What he did was wrong. I was just like, but if you haven't lived in that high demand religion, that thing where it's all you know, and it's not only their fear that God doesn't want them to, it's their fear of going to hell. It's their fear of losing their family for eternity. The fear of letting their entire family down. That's a lot. And it's almost life or death. Mm-hmm. It can feel like life or death to them. Life eternally, or death without my family. And I was very lucky that I didn't have that indoctrination, I feel like, from birth. Because I feel like my kind of, the way I was able to break out of it was because I wasn't that deep. It wasn't, my mom wasn't active. My dad wasn't even religious. If I would have lost my entire family, I don't know if I ever would have been able to break out of that. So I do feel for them, definitely.
I agree wholeheartedly, Taylor. And I just also want to acknowledge, I think it takes a real level of maturity to take that position on it and to see that, because it would be well within your rights to just be angry and to want to go after him. And there isn't anybody that would blame you for that. So to be able to see that side of it and to take that position.
I just want to say, I hold nothing against people that do feel that way too. They're valid to feel like it was a bad person that did a bad thing. That's valid. It is. I just personally don't feel that way. But I would never try to tell someone, well, you should see their side. You should understand it from their perspective, because some people aren't at that place yet. And I had a time where I wasn't at that place yet. So I'm not trying to push anyone into feeling sorry for them at all. That's just where my heart stands on it at this point. That may change.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If I could say one more thing, and then I promise I'm going to quit talking here.
No, absolutely. Go ahead.
I wanted to touch on what you said. I actually had to go look this up after you said it. When you talked about mandated reporters, that actually caught me off guard because obviously the laws are different in different states. And I went up and looked, and by golly, that's amazing that in California, clergy are considered mandated reporters, because it is not that way in all states. In a lot of states, clergy are protected by this clergy penitent privilege. And I don't know if you've heard in the last year or so, I'm in Arizona. There's a huge case that came out of Southern Arizona about a child who was systematically abused her entire childhood, and about a bishop that knew about it. And he's being protected behind Arizona's clergy penitent privilege laws. And it's just awful. And we've got to have some legal reform in this country, and it's got to be across the nation to protect kids. So I feel like the kids in California are a little luckier that their clergy are considered mandated reporters and have to report that stuff.
I agree, absolutely. But did it really matter?
Right.
Not at all. Because basically, I'm sure you guys know the big case against the LDS Church came out. And if you were abused or your abuse was covered up, you could get a lawyer. And I looked into it. I spoke to a lawyer, and they admitted, yeah, he's a mandated reporter. And they submitted my case to the church, but nothing came of it. The church responded and said, we're sorry, not we did anything wrong. Their response was, what they would offer was LDS therapy.
Right.
A therapist that is Mormon.
Right.
And I said, no thanks.
Yeah.
And they also, if let's say I would have accepted it, I could have pushed and countered and tried to get money. To me, it wasn't about money, so it doesn't matter. It was about them knowing what one of their bishops had done.
Right.
Knowing that they had this guy in a place of power that did this to a child. And mine was more about that. I knew they weren't going to admit any fault, but I would have had to sign basically I forget exactly what it's called, but a confidentiality.
Mm-hmm.
Even for the LDS therapy, I had to sign a statement of silence. Basically, I couldn't have done this podcast. I couldn't have ever told anyone my story.
Yep.
I couldn't have done anything. And that's more damaging. In my opinion, I wouldn't have been comfortable taking it, saying I will never speak of it, because that's how this continues to happen. Now, I'm not holding anything against people that have signed those forms at all. I get why you would.
Yep.
But that's the culture of keeping it silent.
Mm-hmm.
That's why people think my story is unique or uncommon, because how many hundreds, thousands of people have signed these forms and they legally now can't tell you what's happened.
Right. And that's why it is so important for people to have a place to tell their stories, because as you said, you thought you were unique. You thought, hey, this doesn't happen to a lot of other people, when in fact it's happening rampantly.
Way, way too often. Yeah. And about the pressure of being with your family forever. Families are forever. If you don't follow the path, you won't be with your family. When I kind of unraveled Mormonism, I realized how little that actually makes sense. Because let's give the example of my mom and her two sisters, right? So let's say that the Mormon view is correct. Just in an assumption, hypothetical. My mom's sister, who married in the temple, the husband would get his own planet to become a god of, right, with spirit children. His son would also get his own planet with spirit children. And all their kids the girls would be with their husbands on their own planets with spirit children. So they're not together. They're not in heaven together. They're all on their own planets. That's not together. Right? So how are they together forever?
Right.
Even in their view.
And incidentally, the church isn't teaching that anymore, by the way.
Really?
The church has rescinded this idea that everyone's getting their own planets. I don't know. Maybe Sarah, do you know a little bit more about that? That came out recently, I guess.
Yeah, they're saying now. I clearly remember as a kid and teenager being taught that clearly.
Same.
I was in
Same.
2000. I went to BYU in 09. They taught that in my classes in 09.
Right. But recently they came out saying, "Oh, we never taught that. That was a misunderstanding. We never taught that." Like totally gaslighting.
We see this a lot with stuff though. They also never taught anything racist or never, apparently that was all. He was speaking as a man, not as a prophet. Yeah, no, it was taught. And imagine, okay, let's say you were raised Mormon and you were raised with this belief and you believed it and you wanted to be a god of your own planet and you worked your whole life for that goal. And then now you're older, close to probably getting that goal, and they say, just kidding. Like, that's also bad for the people who believed it and wanted it. Right. I know people who wanted, I'm going to be a god. Like, they worked their whole life for that. And now they just took it away. So, I mean, do I believe in that? Becoming a god of your own planet? No. But for the people that do and liked that.
Right.
It's unfair all the way around.
It really is unfair all the way around. And that drives home the point once again of why it's so important to tell these stories and talk, because exactly what Sarah said, oh, we never taught that. If you get a generation or two down, pretty soon that's going to become the norm where everybody's just going to say, well, they never said that. They never taught that. That was just like a cultural thing that a handful of people believed back in the day. This is why storytelling and record keeping are so important. You had mentioned the miracle of forgiveness. Last year, actually it was probably 2021. I actually went to one of my local like Deseret Industry type bookstores here, and I went and found a copy of it. And I happened to get a copy that was published. It was an actual print from the 1960s, one of the earliest editions. And I got it on purpose because everyone kept saying that they had read these little things in it. And I just I read it back in the day in the 80s, but I didn't remember reading a lot of those things. And same thing, you find yourself kind of slipping into this, well, like, I don't remember ever hearing that. And so I finally was like, I'm going to get my hands on a copy of this thing. So I did. And I started reading it. It's very, very, very evil. It's even worse than people even remember or know. And I started marking it up. And bottom line is later on, several months later, I, with a friend, had a burn ceremony where we decided to burn a lot of things as a sort of a cleansing ritual. And I actually couldn't throw it in the fire. And the reason is because I decided I'm going to hang on to that book because exactly, it's an original copy from the 1960s. You talk about things like book bans and censorship, and pretty soon you get a couple generations away and it just never existed. It was just some figment of people's imaginations. So this again,
not to get off.
Yeah, go ahead.
Not to get super off topic, but it kind of reminds me of Holocaust deniers. The further we go, the more people don't believe that it happened.
There are many people that don't believe it.
Because we're losing all the people that lived through it.
That's right.
Yeah, because we're losing all the survivors. Once they're all gone, there's no one to say, no, I lived it. I saw it. I was there. So that's why it's so important to keep those stories alive, so that people know there were people who saw it and it happened to firsthand. And I wouldn't have burned the book either. I would have kept it.
I still have it in my possession. I have no plans on burning it or giving it away now, just like you say, as proof. Your example of the Holocaust is brilliant. I'm floored to this day how many people think that it didn't happen or that it wasn't as bad as they said it was. Yep. We still have concentration camps built as museums with relics in them. We have people alive today, all granted, there are very few left who lived through this atrocity and people still don't believe it. So why would we think it would be any different with something like the miracle of forgiveness or the teaching of ownership of planets or anything else? So again, thank you for being vocal. Thank you for your bravery. Thank you for telling your story, because you're adding to the throng of voices that are validating that this shit happened.
Yeah. And it's not one of those, like, so often people in the church are, they learn how to gaslight from the church, like the church saying, oh, we never taught that that, you'll be God's. But then you also have people gaslighting in the church that are like, oh, well, that never happened to me, so that never happened. Like my bishops were all great. My bishops all
Yeah.
helped me. My bishops were, did what they were supposed to do. So that
Yeah.
that was just one guy that was misled. Whereas when we get story upon story upon story like this, it doesn't just happen to one person. It's I forget the word, but it is running rampant. It's systemic, I
Yeah.
think is the word.
I remember when I was young, when we were maybe 10, 11, I'd been baptized, but we weren't going to church, and we were on vacation, and something came up about Mormons, and some other kid or teenager said, "Oh, I heard they believe they get their own planets and they become gods." And I was like, "No, that's not true. I technically am a member, and that's not like, no, like I've never heard something so crazy." And you get that a lot with things that aren't true. Like someone once said, "Can't you not eat meat?" I was like, "No, I can eat meat." But I put them in the same category. Like they were just so wrong. Oh, the church is racist. Oh, no, it's not. Oh, that's sexist. No, it's not. Because I just didn't know. And then I found out and I was shocked. Shocked to believe. I mean, some of the stuff that I'm sure you guys know that I found out about the church race wise absolutely blew my mind. Like separating the blood so that worthy Mormons don't get blood transfusions from African Americans. I almost vomited. No lie. I almost threw up. I could not believe that this was happening not even that long ago. Not even that long ago. And it's just absolutely atrocious. And when people would say like ex-Mormons or never Mormons know more about Mormonism than actual Mormons, I was like, no way. Like, that's not possible. No, it's actually very true. Now I fully understand why my now husband's parents didn't want him dating me. They honestly were fearful because they knew a lot more than I did about my own religion, which, is sad. But then again, if they taught the missionary lessons up front with what they actually believe, they would have no members. So it's like, I get why they do it, but it doesn't make it right either.
Right.
I want to get back a little bit when we were talking about fighting or not fighting.
Yeah.
So many, even women, have this viewpoint of, well, it was rape if you fought. If you didn't fight, then it wasn't technically. No, consent has to be expressly given, enthusiastically given.
Yeah.
It can be taken back. If you're manipulated, that is not consent. Like, that's a huge one, too, that people don't understand.
Right.
And it shocks me that there are actually still, like you said about legal reform, a lot of states that legally, if it was your husband, it was not rape. If you were asleep, it wasn't. If you were intoxicated, if it wasn't a penis, you weren't raped. If it was, there's so many that a lot of people don't even realize that they were assaulted or raped. They honestly don't even know.
Yeah.
Because they heard once that if they didn't fight or if it wasn't penetrative, then it wasn't assault, which is absurd.
Yep. Yeah, in that interview that I just did not long ago had something like that where one of the assaults that she was talking about, she was like, well, I didn't fight and I didn't even really say, she's like, I only said no once, but then after that I just submitted. So really, I don't know if that was really an assault because, and I told her, I was like, it absolutely was. I was like, that was not your fault. I said, after everything else you had been through, that's how you came to survive,
Well, let me point out this, and I've actually never shared this, I don't think, with anyone except my husband. And I may ask you to cut this out later. I don't know. Maybe I'll be comfortable. But after I was assaulted, I had another friend of mine come over and we were hanging out. And he started to, make moves on me. I didn't want to, but I didn't say no. I literally just laid there, dead silent and frozen. Because it was like a few weeks later and I was terrified. And in my mind, it was, well, it didn't do anything last time. So it was almost like if I just sit here, it's less traumatic to me. And if I would have said no, he very well may have not done anything. Yeah. I will never know. Looking back, was that the right thing to do? No, but I was a teenager and I was traumatized and terrified.
Yeah.
In his mind, I honestly don't think he did anything wrong. This was years ago and things have changed, But honestly, he was a teenager too. In his mind, would he have ever in a million years thought it was assault? No. And I get that. I honestly, he just thought I was, probably fine with it. But that's why it's so important to talk about these things and to teach men about enthusiastic consent, because a lot of women have had some kind of assault, and then they're not going to necessarily feel comfortable saying no. After that, I stopped hanging out with men completely because I couldn't trust myself to say no.
Yeah.
Then again, if we teach men that it doesn't have to be a no, it has to be a yes. You don't wait for the no, you wait for the yes. Then we don't have to fear that kind of response. But it's so convoluted and twisted because there are some women that in that position would have said yes because they felt traumatized and they felt inside like it was the only way to stay safe. So even then, sometimes when they say yes, is that on the man? No. But it also, like, that's why I think individual, personal, internal healing is very important, because sometimes it's not on the other person. Like, if you feel the need to say yes, they don't know what's going on inside internally. So that's why healing within yourself is so important, so that you can feel comfortable putting up boundaries, especially after you've been in a high demand religion, because boundaries are hard. And also, feel comfortable that you don't have to say yes.
Yeah.
Because I know that's hard for a lot of women, even that are married. They feel like, well, if I say no, my husband's going to feel like I don't want him. Or if I don't feel like doing it, he's going to XYZ. That's okay. It's okay to not feel like it. It's okay to not want to do it. And you always have the choice, whether you're married, in a relationship, or not.
Yeah. I actually was thinking that, and I wasn't going to say it out loud, but then you just brought it up. That's actually been, I am going through a divorce currently, but I had been, and we've been together almost 20 years. But like when we had been together 10 years, we almost split up at that point. And at that point, I didn't want to split up. I didn't want a divorce. And I had made like resolutions to be a better wife. And that was one of them, to like never turn him down, even when I didn't want to. And, for the following 8 years, that was how I lived my marriage. And now the marriage is ending now. And it, that didn't help at all. And it just caused more trauma for me. And like you were saying with your friend, if he knew that, like, he wasn't, in his mind, he wasn't raping or assaulting or anything, but there was many times that there was not enthusiastic consent.
Mm-hmm.
And I just let it happen because I wanted to be a good wife. And that's what we're taught within the church, to be a good wife, to always be available to your husband. And, if he goes looking elsewhere, then you're not available to him. Or if you're not available to him, he's going to go look elsewhere. And you know what? My marriage still fell apart.
Mm-hmm.
and now I'm happy it did. It needed to. But I wish that I would have let it fall apart, 10 years ago, and not put myself through that 8 years of that. So, yeah.
I think a lot of it comes down to when you're raised in the church with purity culture too. It went immediately. One day, sin is like a mortal sin and you're going to hell. And then the next day, I'm supposed to want it and love it and do it all the time.
Right.
And you can't. Your brain just cannot get there the minute you say I do. It can't. It honestly, it takes time to unravel all of that. And then you have the culture of always be willing. Like, you don't want to turn him down. You don't want to make him feel bad. I'm so sorry that you felt like to be a better wife meant to always be willing to have sex, because that is not the equivalent of a good wife. The equivalent of a good husband is understanding and knowing that it's not always going to be wanted. And that's okay.
Yeah, for sure. Christina, what were you about to say earlier? I kind of cut you off. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. It's totally fine. It just piggybacking on everything you guys have said. To add to that, I think there's this, Kendra and I talk a lot about this idea that within the church, it isn't just sex, it's kind of everything. We're almost taught that we're not allowed to have boundaries around anything. It's that whole idea of don't turn down a calling, be available, don't say no to your husband. I don't think they're, at least well, let me not make assumptions. I don't know what they're teaching anymore because I've been out of it for a while now. But there was this idea when I was growing up, even at church dances, like, don't turn down a boy that asks you to dance, even if your spidey senses tell you this person is dangerous. Like, my intuition is telling me stay away from this guy, but my leaders have told me don't say no. When the Relief Society president calls you and says, can you make a meal for this family? You're not allowed to have this boundary that says, I'm going through a hard time right now, and that just doesn't work for me. It's this never ending give of yourself until you bleed yourself dry. And so is it any wonder that in every other aspect of our lives, it spills over and people have a hard time saying no. They don't know how to make boundaries. It's just a really tough thing.
Yeah. That's why I want to reiterate, I feel very lucky that I wasn't completely raised in that from birth. Because if I had been, something I didn't mention is that first meeting with my bishop where he said I should date. He actually pointed out one specific person that he thought I would be great for me to date. And the guy was aging out. So he was like 29 and I was 16. And if I had been raised in that, I may have very well gone on a date with a 29-year-old. Now, I don't know if this guy knew. The guy may have been like, no, you're 16. I don't know. But because I wasn't raised in it, even that, I subconsciously got this inkling. They just want him married before he ages out. And they think I'm so young. I'm just going to listen and do it. And I knew girls at BYU that it was the week before their wedding and they didn't know anything about sex. They didn't know what it was. I remember specifically we were doing a project and a girl was getting married in 2 weeks and someone made a joke, probably wasn't an appropriate one, but about a blowjob, and she said, what is that? And the guy said, like, oral sex. And she said, what? And they leaned over and kind of whispered, and she goes, people do that. This 20-something-year-old is getting married, and in 2 weeks they expect her to just be open and giving of all of these things that she didn't even know what they were 2 weeks ago. How can you expect someone mentally to transition that quickly? And then they raise the men to be, if your women aren't giving, if they're not submitting enough, so they're not good enough, for you. And then you get men that think the women just need to, like you said, be giving everything of themselves until there's nothing left. It's crazy. And now I see it very much as the singles ward is kind of a meat market, and they just don't like people aging out without being married. So this one's about to age out. He's single. This one's new. Pair them together and we're good because no one ages out unmarried. Looking back, I wasn't really even viewed as an individual person with human feelings and a human experience. It was like, you're an object, he's an object, put you together, we can make a family of objects. It felt very like that was the whole point. And it didn't matter at all that I was uncomfortable. And just the fact that I voiced that I was uncomfortable with it shows that I wasn't necessarily brought up in that strict structure, because I know a lot of women wouldn't have even voiced that it made them uncomfortable to want to date someone that much older. And I was very open about it. That kind of makes me uncomfortable. I'm only 16, but regardless, it was still, that's what God wants. It's okay. Once you're graduated from high school, your goal is to get married and have kids. But I could have seen if it was strict the way my mom was raised, or even some of these people in Utah, they may have never even questioned it. They may have just done it, and very well may have gotten married to a 39-year-old when they were 16. Well, I don't know.
I mean, look at Joseph Smith and all the other founding, people, men of the church that had teenage brides, that that's probably how they got them. This is God's will for me to marry you.
Exactly. And one teaching that I think is prevalent in a lot of this is the Mormon belief that God physically had sex with Mary. right? They believe that he actually physically had sex with Mary to conceive Jesus. Well, she was 13. So if God can do it and it's good and great and fine, yeah, that's technically today would be statutory rape. I don't think she ever knew, so no consent. So that's just rape and statutory rape. But if God would do it, then it can't be bad
Right.
for us to do it. And I think a lot of people rationalize these things around the beliefs of the church. Well, if Joseph Smith married a young girl, then I can, because he's like a god anyways to them, kind of worshiped like one at least. So I think those teachings, although they don't seem dangerous when you first glance at them, even like the miracle of forgiveness, I had read it before I was ever raped, and it seemed a little odd, but I never realized how detrimental that would be to someone who had experienced assault. Two other things I'll touch on in that vein is the lesson that I'm sure we all had, where they pass the bubble gum or the cupcake and everyone touches it. Do you want this piece or do you want that piece? Because that one's dirty and it's been touched and chewed. And my mom, when I was growing up, she would talk about how this was her favorite thing her dad did for her friends every year. And he would pass around a piece of bubble gum. And I think to her, it made a good point of, I want to stay pure. But to me, the first time I heard it, I hadn't even been assaulted yet. And I was like, ooh, yikes. Because here's the thing. In my belief as a Christian, when God forgives us, we are pure again in his sight. And that gum is never going to be clean again. So it doesn't equivalate. There's no way to be like, but once you repent, you're this gum again. And the Mormons don't believe that anyway. Sorry, the Latter-day Saints don't believe that anyways. So for me, especially after I was assaulted and these lessons would come up, it was like, but I didn't choose to be the dirty piece of gum. But even if I did, it doesn't make me less worthy of love and salvation and all these things. To me, people lie, cheat, steal stuff every day. Why is sex in the church so much bigger, like the worst sin? When people are doing things all the other time, like rape to them isn't even as big of a deal as a woman choosing to have sex. That blows my mind. I can choose to have sex with someone, and it's a bigger deal than if someone forces me. It's just mind blowing. And that gum or the cupcake or whatever it is, where everyone takes a bite, everyone, I think almost every LDS woman I know went through that lesson in some form. The flower, that something where you're just not as wanted. No one wants you, and you're dirty, kind of, if you've been around. And then the second one is after I left the church. One year I was just for fun, kind of like you read the Miracle of Forgiveness, just looking up what they talked about at General Conference. And I wish I knew the name of the talk and who gave it, but he was talking about purity and morality. And one of the lines said, non-consensual sexual impurity. And I said, that's not even a thing. Non-consensual sexual impurity does not exist. If it's non-consensual, you're not impure. Even if it is consensual, or like, I could see a religion saying that if it's consensual, you're impure. But if it's not consensual, how do you get the sentence? Who wrote that and read that and approved that and thought saying non-consensual sexual impurity was a good phrase? Perfect.
Yeah.
Come
Who
on.
was that?
And that was in 2021 or something, 2020 maybe.
Who was that gave a talk? I mean, it was a long time ago. I forget who it was. Maybe Christina, you remember, but he was talking about, like, it started out sounding good, talking about people that had been victimized and you can go to your bishop for help, which you tried. But then it said, they said something like, God will help you realize your degree of responsibility for what happened, and it totally turned into it. And it was a conference talk, totally turned into victim blaming, saying, there's always a degree, who was that? Do you remember, Christina?
I'm going to look it up because I have a name in my head, but I don't want to misattribute it. So while you guys are talking, I'm going to find that quote.
Yeah.
And another thing is they will always find something, whether it was what you were wearing, whether it was what you said. Even me, the fact that I agreed to go to prom with him may have sent the wrong signals, even though I said just as a friend. I even had people, since I've been older and started talking about it a little bit more. I don't talk about it much, but I have. I talk about it mostly when I'm discussing with people who are LDS that are like, that stuff never happens. And I'm like, well, it happened to me. This is what happened. Are you still going to try to rationalize and support it? Because that's pretty bad. But they would say, like, well, you had a male in your home and your parents weren't home. Like, what did you think was going to happen? Well, my parents were home. They left for like 2 seconds. And I was a naive, innocent teenager that's mind was on the farthest thing from that. When, especially, and it's kind of to an unsafe level too, that the LDS young girls know nothing about any sex or anything like that. It's a little bit unsafe because some girls that are Mormon wouldn't know that male teenagers would even have that on their mind or want to do that. For safety reasons, people need to know these things too. You don't think about it when you're raised in this sex is so bad thing. It's like, well, then why would anyone else
Right.
want to do it either? If it's so bad, you don't even realize that most other people are doing it, even though you don't know about it.
Yeah.
So to kind of figure out the line of how do you have them remain safe. I know a lot of people are like, well, if we tell them about it, we're encouraging them to do it. No, not really. Like, if I would have known about it, it wouldn't have encouraged me to do it. I would have just known what boundaries I need to put in place so that things I don't want to happen don't happen.
Right. It actually is empowering to talk about these
Yeah.
things. It's not encouraging, it's empowering.
That's something I will say about my mom. She was really great about, she was very open about sex. She was very open about, at a time period where, and especially because she was raised Mormon, even though she married my dad and was inactive, most people would have said she was too open with us about it, I think, at that time. Today, a lot more parents are, but she was very, we talked about it from the time I was very young. She went as far as to tell us, if a guy starts, whispering something in your ear, what you may feel in your body, does that necessarily mean you want to have sex? No, but you are going to feel things. You are going to feel emotions. You are going to feel. And in that sense, I was more prepared than a lot of girls would have been in my situation because I knew a lot more about it. So she was very good about that, but I think a lot of people that are raised in the church don't get that openness
Absolutely.
about sex with their parents.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I found that quote, by the way, and given everything that we're talking about, I would like to read it if it's okay with you guys.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Because it's so pertinent. It's Richard G. Scott, and I'm glad I looked it up because the name I had in my head was somebody different. So Richard G. Scott, it was from a conference talk. And I'll get the title for you here in just a minute. But the quote says,
do you have the date as well?
Yeah, what was the date?
Do I have what? I'm sorry?
The date?
The date, like here?
Let me get that for you after I read the quote, because number one, I don't want to lose my place. And number two, if I recall correctly, and I will look at this when we're done, if I recall correctly, I believe this talk was released twice. I believe that it was released when he initially gave it, and then I think it was reprinted some years later. So I don't want to, I'd like to look those up. And actually, it'd be interesting to do a side-by-side on them to see what was edited for later usage, because they do also like to do things like that, where they will edit things out and they'll change things and re-release them, and nobody is the wiser.
Yep.
So I believe, if I recall, this is one such talk that was released twice, because I posted this on my own social media account a couple years ago. But this is what he says. And, to anybody that's listening to this, like, hold on to your hats, because it's pretty bad. It says, the victim must do all in his or her power to stop the abuse. I'm going to read that one more time. Okay. This was said by a church general authority. The victim must do all in his or her power to stop the abuse. Most often, the victim is innocent because of being disabled by fear or the power or authority of the offender. At some point in time, however, the Lord may prompt a victim to recognize a degree of responsibility for abuse. There you have it. Richard G. Scott, Quorum of the 12 Apostles. This was a talk he gave entitled Healing the Tragic Scars of Abuse. And I'm going to find the dates on that. I'm going to have to look that up here.
So someone who was abused would see that title and think, oh, this may help me. Right? Healing the tragic scar. This may help me. Like I went to my bishop, come to terms with this. First, just between us three, for the listeners, for you guys, did that make you literally sick to your stomach? Because that made me sick to my stomach.
Yeah, like, it's a very visceral and physical response. Yes.
Yes. And I don't know if that's just because we've been through that situation, because I don't know if I would have had that reaction had I not ever been abused. I'm not sure. But to hear that makes so much more sense after you reading that. Why the bishop asked me, did I fight? Did I scream? Was I held down? He was trying to figure out if I did everything in my power to prevent it, because if I didn't, it wasn't technically rape.
Right.
Probably had read that exact thing and was like, well, she had to do everything in her physical power. Okay, well, let's just hypothetical this. How can anyone determine what is ever all of your physical effort or what's physically in my power? How can they determine what level I'm capable of? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
To physically prevent it.
And again, you couldn't have.
Yeah, they're saying women that don't fight, again, they are saying, this is not our view, but they're saying that if you don't fight, it basically wasn't rape because you didn't do everything in your power to prevent it, which is so absurd. And I want to know the year, because you would expect that was from way long ago.
It's not as old as you might think. And so, by the way, for anybody that's wondering, I just would like to clarify that I am reading, I pulled it up. This is from churchofjesuschrist.org. This is literally from the church's own website. I'm not getting this from like a third-party person who's breaking down the talks or anything like this.
I said, you're not reading from anti-Mormon sources.
No, I'm going straight to the source, straight from the church's website. And it does say from Elder Scott's April 1992 and April 2008 General Conference addresses. And then it says capitalization and punctuation standardized. So I was right. This was released twice in 92 and as recently as 08. And for those of us that are old, like 92 also was just yesterday, just for clarification's sake.
Let's put that in, just to put that into perspective. I was born in 92. My rape was in 09. I believe 09. So that was a year. So that's basically the general conference talk that was probably closest to the year I was raped. So I would have looked that up and read that. I thought you were going to say like decades and decades, and it still would have been bad.
Correct.
But 2008.
Yeah.
That blows my hand. When you read the date, my hand literally covered my mouth, like in shock.
Yeah.
That is so awful.
That's crazy.
It's pretty heinous. Yeah. Victim blaming at its finest.
They're still giving the miracle of forgiveness to victims. That's just as bad, if not way worse.
Well, let me actually touch on that. And I'm not at all trying to contradict what you're saying, Taylor, not even a little bit. But I actually wonder about that, just because I believe the miracle of forgiveness is out of print now. I think the church received such a huge backlash from it that they quit printing it. Now, I don't know if it's still available in like PDF format on any church site. That's another thing. I'll have to go digging around and finding that. But I know about a year ago, people were kind of rejoicing because if you go to Deseret Book, .com or .org, which is who the publisher, it finally said no longer available, like out of print. And so I don't know if they're actually still giving that book out, but if they aren't, I can guarantee you, well, this is my opinion. I shouldn't say I guarantee. It's my opinion. It is my opinion that it came on the heels of social pressure, because there are a lot of movements out there. I hope I don't quote or give credit to the wrong person, but I think Kyle Ashworth of Latter Gay Stories podcast. I could be wrong about this. So if it's not you, Kyle, I apologize. I think he or the people at Latter Gay Stories actually initiated a campaign to collect as many of those books as they could to get them out of like bookstores and get them out of people's houses. And I think they held a black tie event around it once they had collected enough books. But
that makes sense. Let me clarify what I meant though. I have been told, I'm under the impression, the people that I've spoke to recently that have been given this, they were never given the actual book. It was a pamphlet. It was a pamphlet about sexual assault that had quotes pulled from the book. So it like basically was a kind of like the talk, healing the scars of sexual assault. But then there were quotes from Kimball that were from the Miracle of Forgiveness. Maybe that was their way around the fact. Because I know in the olden days they give you the book, but now it's
isn't that
a
sly?
Pamphlet, at least from what I've been told. I've seen photos of the pamphlet.
Yeah.
I've never been given the pamphlet. The last one that I was told where the woman got it was in 2019. So that's new enough for me. I don't think they've stopped since then. Yeah. But it wasn't the entire book. But quote about it's better to die than basically live with impurity. Mm-hmm. I don't know it word for word, but it insinuates that.
Yep.
Is in that pamphlet.
It sure does.
That quote is in the pamphlet.
That's a very sly workaround on their part. If they're going to pull that book from the shelves, that makes perfect sense, Taylor, that they would pull out their favorite quotes and keep those alive, even if they're not going to keep the book in print.
I still think too, another way a bishop could get around it is to even say, well, like in your talk with the bishop, well, President Kimball said, yada, yada, yada. They can quote it, which is still just as bad, or even referring them to it. Like, oh, I'm sure you can Google it. You should read The Miracle of Forgiveness by Kimball, and then they can Google it. So even if it's been out of print, which I love, and I think that was great, and I think it shouldn't be printed anymore, there are ways for them to still, and I think it's a way of them to like underhandedly victim blame. Like they're not blaming you outright, but they're pointing to a source that blames you. So then you don't want to talk about it.
Right.
Because you now feel like it's your fault. And then if you don't talk about it, people think the ones that are talking about it are the uncommon, unique outliers. So I think it's all tied together.
We'll just I agree 100%. We'll just marinate and steep everything in shame, because what does shame do? Shame silences, right?
The biggest thing, not even with myself, but I think the biggest thing that I let go of when I left the LDS church was shame. It was around everything. Mm-hmm. If you weren't doing enough, if you weren't giving all of yourself, if I wasn't in church every Sunday, if I wasn't paying tithing even though I was poor, if I wasn't, they use shame as a behavior modification tool. Because if you feel enough shame, you will change what you do. And also, when you feel that shame, I've been disabled since I was born. So even when I was active, I couldn't physically go to church a lot. I was in the hospital a lot. I was ill a lot. And I always felt so much shame around that. I always had to justify it. Like, oh, I wasn't here because da-da-da. Or I didn't because da-da-da. Or have them bring sacrament to my house because gosh forbid I didn't take it or whatnot. And it's just, when you're covered in that shame, you always feel like you have to make an excuse of why you can't or won't do something. but the excuse has to also be good enough. Like you said, it can't just be, I'm having a really hard time right now, so I can't serve. It has to be,
Right.
that's not good
Yeah.
enough. That's not a good enough reason.
Well, I mean, how about just no as a
Right.
complete sentence? That's unacceptable. Like we always felt like we had to tie some, like I have to
Right.
justify my no. I have to say why I'm saying no. And why do they use shame and fear?
Yeah.
Because it works. Shame and fear keep people in line.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the
Yeah.
bottom line, right?
Absolutely. I remember when my shelf first broke and I didn't believe anymore, completely, lost my testimony. I remember I think it was like a couple weeks following. I was sitting there and realized that I felt different, and I was kind of reflecting as to why, and I realized it was because that shame and guilt that was my companion for 38
Yep.
years was gone. Like I suddenly felt no shame, no guilt. I felt at peace for where I was and what I was
Yep.
and who I am. And it was something that I had never had before, because before it was never good enough.
Right.
No matter how hard you tried, it was never good enough. And you always had that shame, always had that guilt. And so once I no longer believed in the church, I learned to believe in myself. And I no longer, like, that shame and guilt was gone. And it was like a physical, like I could feel it.
Oh
It was
yeah,
crazy.
I could feel it. Well, it's like a weight off your chest and your back. And for me,
Absolutely.
I found that in Christ, in the Bible, and Christianity, and
Yep.
no matter where anyone finds it, it's great, and everyone should try to find it because it's an amazing feeling
Yep.
to have that release of that weight on you 24/7. I feel like it's like the first time, if you're holding your breath, that first big deep breath you get of like, wow, that's enough air. That's what it feels like.
Yep.
And it's like you're walking on eggshells your whole life, and then finally you're not.
Right.
And I got that feeling of I am enough just as I am. I don't have to feel shame for something that wasn't my fault, through Christianity and the Bible. And how I relate it is, it was like the Mormon church, they use shame as shackles. Basically, they shackle you with the shame, and then they throw you in an ocean of guilt and you drown because you can't get up because you're shackled. And my key to the shackles was through Christianity and Jesus and the Bible. But people should find their key wherever it is, because once you come up and you're not shackled, I felt so free of like, I don't have to carry this. It was like a rucksack I was carrying all the time of
All the time.
my past, everything I'd done wrong, everything that had happened to me, everything that I hadn't done and had done. And once you let that go, it doesn't hold you
Mm-hmm.
back anymore. And I felt like I could finally choose to kind of be whoever I wanted to be without that rucksack of, well, this is where I've been before.
Yeah.
And it really is weird how you wouldn't think that it would be something you physically feel, but I did. It's something I physically, actually in my body, felt it.
Yeah, I relate to that. I actually felt physically lighter. My shoulders felt physically lighter. I felt like 50 pounds had been lifted off of my physical body. Yeah.
And for me, the biggest one is the breath. I felt like for years I'd been like plugging my nose or just breathing through my nose, or like, and then finally you can take the time to actually take a deep breath, and it changes everything. It really does.
Yep.
Yep.
So that's why, part of why I feel so much for the people that are in the church, whether they're fully in, whether they're on the fence, because I know what that weight is like, and it can completely change a person. I mean, it's so much weight and pressure and shame and guilt from every angle. Even when you're not shamed for something, you're afraid you will be shamed for this something. So it doesn't
100%.
even matter if it's not actively happening, because you know enough people that it has happened to. So it's like when people say, well, my ward wasn't like that. Well, my bishop wasn't like that. But you still probably felt the fear of if they were, and what had happened to other people that you had heard of. And I do think there are some places like Utah, I think, is a lot worse than other places. California is pretty Mormon centralized too now, but I think there are some people who may never experience this type of stuff in Mormonism. But then I do question, and I'm not questioning their experience, but I do question, did they not experience it? Or is it one of those things that we experienced and then put on our shelf and shut the door and pretended like we didn't experience until the time came that we were capable of actually seeing it? Because some of these people, I wonder, because there's something still today that I think, okay, yeah, I should have noticed that when it happened, but I didn't until 10 years later when it all fell apart, because I think we have such this need to, that didn't happen, push it down and hide it, that we don't see it. Because people ask me a lot, how did you not know that what the bishop said was wrong? And I'm just like, I don't know. I just believed it. Like, I just didn't. Now it's so clear. And I think if I had never been in that situation, I would ask the same thing of someone. Like, really, how did you not know? Like, even the lawyer I was working with was like, did you? Because I ended up having epilepsy years later. I was having seizures daily. I became epileptic at 19. And they had asked me, in the last 5 years, has anything traumatic happened that could have led to this? Because this can happen from like trauma. At first, they thought they were like trauma induced seizures or like something, an emotional response instead of neurological ones. And I was so ingrained in that I promised not to tell. He said I couldn't tell. I just kept saying no. It came up in my mind, but I was just like, no, nothing happened. And my lawyer asked me at the time, you really didn't think that it was better to tell a doctor when something that big was affecting your life? I mean, in 2018, I was in a coma from my seizures. So something that big was affecting my life, and I still didn't feel safe enough to talk about it. He was like, I can't even fathom that. I was like, yeah, it honestly never crossed my mind that it was okay to tell the doctors, like, yeah, actually, I was assaulted and then it was covered up and I was blackmailed. And maybe that's the trauma that's causing this, because I was so sure that what he had said was from God and it was the right way to do it. Now, they did end up finding out they were actually neurological seizures. But still, the fact that I didn't feel comfortable answering that question honestly shows how deeply ingrained you are into believing that that's the right way. It was literally, I had to quit college. I had to stop driving. I had seizures every day for 10 years. They just stopped in 2020 or 2021. And it never, I wouldn't have. Now today I'd be like, yeah, for sure this happened. But back then I was too deeply in. Luckily in 2020 we found out I was never epileptic. All the seizures for 10 years of not leaving my house were a side effect to a medication.
Mm-hmm.
So I started a medication when I was 14 for something completely different. And then it took 5 years for the bad side effects to start. And for me, the side effects were seizures. And I had them every single day for 10 years. Couldn't drive, work, or go to school. Couldn't really leave my house except to go to the doctor, because I had multiple every single day. And then in 2020, I never had any indication that it was from the medicine. I just felt like, I don't think I need this medication anymore. I feel like I should go off of it. I stopped taking it May 24th, and my last seizure was May 26th. Once it left my system, I've never had another one.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really amazing.
Yeah, it was just really poignant when the lawyer was like, really something that was seriously detrimental to your life, like very much affecting your life, and you still never even questioned. Well, I almost kind of got the thought that he was, if I'm being honest, was like not contradicting me, but like questioning me. Like, are you really, really? And I was like, no, I swear, it literally never even crossed my mind, because after a while you start to believe their narrative
Absolutely.
that it was your fault, that you did do something wrong. So why would I tell someone? Why would I, you know, God doesn't want me to, and it was me. So why would I even think about it like that? And that takes a lot of unraveling.
In all of this that you just said, like that you kind of went over everything with your attorney and how people will ask you, how did you not see it? Most of the time when you're describing it, you're saying things like, I wasn't comfortable, or I was told this, or I was, made to believe this. You said something one time, and you said it really quick and really fast, and it just sort of came out in the middle of your sentence. But it's really profound, and I want to point it out. You said, I didn't feel safe. And I want to point out that this is why most of us can't see things when we're in the middle of them, because it's not safe to do so. And when our bodies think that it's not safe, we're not going to know. Our brains are not going to allow us to see things from the perspective of something that's not safe. We go into self-preservation. We go into safety mode for ourselves. And if something's not safe, we're just going to avoid it. And it is wild to me how we can be blind, completely blind to things because of safety. I just thought that was kind of interesting. I wanted to point that out, that in all of that talking, you said it.
And I'm glad you did, because I didn't even realize I said it.
You said it so fast, and it was just this like little thing that was thrown in the middle of a sentence. And I picked it out quickly because that's the crux of everything. That's it. That's why we didn't see it. Because here's an example that I use. This is an off the wall example, but it'll kind of illustrate the point. And I've told this in my own story too. When I went through the temple for the first time, I remember this moment, this exact moment where they were doing one of the parts of the ceremony in the temple. And I remember that feeling of cognitive dissonance deep within my soul, where I thought, wait a minute, what is going on here? This doesn't feel right. But when I looked around the room and I saw all these really smart, intelligent people that were doing this and buying into it, and they didn't seem to think this was a problem, that became an unsafe moment for me. It was not safe for me to raise my hand and say, what the heck is going on here? This doesn't feel right to me. That would have been the most unsafe thing I could do, because it would have thrown my pending marriage into the toilet. It would have disappointed all the relatives that had come from far and wide to be there with me in that moment. Like, there's so many ramifications that our bodies just silence us and shut us down. We can't speak out. And when you're in the middle of it is not the time to be able to process and say, oh, I should have seen this, or I should have seen that. And so I think we have to be careful with ourselves too, when we look back at some of the things we went through, that we don't, I think the saying is, we can't judge our past selves by the knowledge and education standards that we have today. We were doing the best we could in the moments that we had with what we knew at the time.
And I think that's really important too. And I think it probably was just kind of like subconscious, not even thought about when I said it, but it's a great point, because I think it's also important to touch on, you said it's not safe when you're in it, but sometimes it takes a long time after you're out to realize that you are now safe and you can now discuss it. And I think that's why so many of us don't talk about it for 10 years or longer, because it takes it's almost like your mind has to catch up. You have to trust, am I really? Is this all going to shift and I'm not going to be safe? Is this the way it's going to stay? And I think that's why, even though I'd already been out of the church, I hadn't removed my records, but even though I had stopped going and I kind of didn't believe anymore, I still hadn't gotten to that point where it felt okay. And another thing, I also, like I said, you honestly stop even realizing, you start to believe and question yourself.
Yep.
So many times I've honestly questioned myself about what happened.
Yep.
Did it really happen that way, etc. You get people questioning it so many times, you kind of sometimes start to think you're crazy.
Yep.
Maybe I imagined it. Okay, but I know I didn't. But, and then you think, well, is the fact that I think I might have imagined it mean that I'm crazy and I did it? It's a spiral.
Yep.
And you can't break the cycle sometimes.
And that's normal.
Yeah, it is very. And it's also very normal. I have found, I didn't know, but very normal to not talk about it for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
Most people, that's why I think it's so great that they've changed those laws about the statute of limitations in some places, because so many people are not going to talk about it right away. They don't even, a lot of us didn't even realize what was happening for however many years, or what had happened for however many years. How can you talk about something and try to convict something or whatever that it took you years to even realize was happening or what had happened?
Right.
So I think that's a great point you made, and it's just interesting. Another factor that the lawyer brought up that I thought was interesting is, the rule that the church changed about interviewing minors.
Oh yeah.
And how parents can actually be in the room.
Yeah.
Now, he mostly worked with LDS cases against the LDS church for abuse. And he had a very weird take on this, because your first initial reaction is, oh, that's great, right? That's a great change. The reason they did it may not be so much, but it's great that they can have parents in the room, right?
Right.
He said that actually he thinks it's a bigger problem than before, because most of these, and he thinks that the church did it kind of like the miracle of forgiveness, underhanded, so that it looks great, but it's actually better for them, because most of the abuse that is happening, or a lot of it from these kids, is from the parents. But a lot of his cases would be from when a kid opened up to their bishop about their parents abusing them.
Yeah.
And then if the bishop did the right thing, it would go somewhere. If they didn't, it wouldn't. He said, now, let's say I'm a dad and I'm abusing my child, and I know my child's going to have a meeting with the bishop, and I can say, nope, I need to be in there. I know my child isn't going to mention it. I know I'm safe, because if I'm standing there, they're afraid of me, and my kid's not going to bring it up. Whereas if they go to their bishop and they feel safe, they will tell them if their parent's not in the room, and then it may come up, which I agree with to a certain extent. I think that there are bishops, obviously, he had cases where they do the right thing and they do report it, and it does get handled, whether well or not. But at least the kid felt safe to tell someone, and someone knew. And at that point, it's probably maybe 50-50. I don't know the statistics, which way it goes.
Yeah.
But if an abusive parent can be in the room 100% of the time, it's not going to come out. And I just thought that was a really interesting view on it that had never crossed my mind.
Sure.
That is a really interesting view.
Because he thinks that from the church's point of view, if the parents are in there, the kids won't say anything, and then it's not on the bishop. My hands are clean. He thinks they did it so they had so many people telling them, and then if they did the right thing, it looks bad because Mormons are abusive. If they don't do the right thing, it looks bad because they broke the law.
Yeah.
Whereas if a parent's in there, it kind of takes it out of the bishop's hands. Now they're not going to say anything, so it's not on us.
Right.
Does that make sense, Paul?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sense.
Yeah, it does. And you would hope that child would hopefully have somewhere else they can go, such as a teacher somewhere else. But yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where I think the church has done a lot of those things where it looks like, oh, this is such a great change. Like, this is good. But then somehow there's like a backdoor or an underhanded way where it looks good and it might be better, but it's still, they're only going to do something. They're only going to make a change that is beneficial to them.
Absolutely.
In any way. So it may look like they're just trying to make other people happy, but if it is not incentivizing or beneficial to them, they would not have done it.
True.
So I thought that was huge, and it makes me question. Now I look at everything they do a little bit differently. Maybe this has an ulterior motive, or maybe this isn't just them trying to be better.
Right.
And is that a little cynical? Maybe. But it's hard not to be cynical when you've lived it and seen so many other people live it.
100%.
Yeah. So I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I hadn't thought about it like that. It's a very interesting take on it.
I hadn't
Yeah.
either. I had seen it as, them giving into social pressures,
Mm-hmm.
after the, gosh, well, I can't think of names today. He was on our podcast. He does Protect LDS.
Oh, Sam Young.
Sam Young.
I knew who you were talking about, but I'm bad with names too.
Yeah, once he started speaking up and being vocal, they excommunicate him, and then they make the changes that he called for.
Yeah.
But
Well,
yeah,
Which
I hadn't even thought of that.
Which I just want to preface. I think that everything he did was for the right reasons and correct. He was genuinely trying to protect people. I don't think he had anything to do with like this underground. I think they just found a way where they could kill two birds with one stone.
Absolutely.
We can make people think we're being acceptive and changing and trying to be better while also it's beneficial to us.
Yeah.
Because another thing is, people talk a lot about like, not even if you're raped, not necessarily even if you have sex, but just the explicit questions that come from bishop interviews. And why do they even need to be asked? To me, they don't. But if anything, do you keep the law of chastity? Do you keep the word of wisdom? Period. End of story. But like I said, even with me when I was raped, it was very, very detailed. What did he touch? Where did he touch? And I know it's that way even if you're not raped. It's just they like a lot of details.
Yeah.
And me, I cannot imagine being a grown man talking to a child and feeling comfortable addressing any of that.
Yeah.
Right.
And the biggest thing to point out here is that these are untrained men. Like,
yes.
Great point.
They're not even trained. It's so unsafe.
Because I could see like if you're going to therapy for it,
right.
Sometimes there's a reason to be very detailed because it helps you process it. But untrained men, it just comes off creepy. Like they don't need to know what I do on my own time, and the questions just blow my mind, especially because I don't think people realize these questions start young. They don't. These aren't adults. These are children.
They start at like baptism at age 8.
Yep.
Now they weren't with me. They weren't basically at 8. It was, do you keep the law of chastity? Do you keep the word of wisdom? It didn't get really detailed until I was a teenager.
Yeah.
But even as a teenager, even if you're not having sex, like even if you don't go there to repent, which having to repent to a bishop is absurd anyways, but
yeah,
even if you're not going to repent, just the general questions, how is this playing into just a general interview? At the very least, it seems like grooming.
Oh, absolutely.
At the very least. And again, the bishop roulette. Some bishops don't. They're just like, do you keep the word of wisdom? Do you keep the law of chastity? Yes. Which proves that the questions are not needed.
Yeah.
Because if the detailed questions, let's say hypothetically Mormonism's true and real, and God really needs to know these details, they would make everyone ask.
Yeah.
It would be like standardized. So that just proves that they're not needed.
Yep.
Well, anything else you guys want to touch on?
I think it's been fantastic. I think we have touched on so many good topics and so many things that, like we said, the more vocal people are, the more that other people will relate and will know that it doesn't just happen to one person. It's systemic, and it's, the abuse that people suffer is bad enough. And then to have it compounded with the church, sweeping it under the rug or punishing the victim blaming, makes it so much worse. And it's so damaging and so dangerous. So I appreciate you sharing your story. I appreciate you being so raw and real with us. That's exactly what's needed. And that's exactly what this podcast is about.
One thing I did want to say is, for people listening that maybe haven't shared their stories, is I wanted to do this multiple times. I got cold feet, but for years I felt like it wasn't worth talking about or sharing my story because it wasn't that bad. And it was just not that big of a deal. I felt because I wasn't raped by a Mormon, I wasn't raped by a bishop, I wasn't, the abuser wasn't Mormon. I felt as though there are people that I know that have had it much worse. that mine wasn't as bad, so it didn't matter. But I think that that's part of what keeps us silent and feeling like it's less common and that it's only us, because a lot of people feel like, oh, it wasn't that bad, it wasn't that big of a deal, so it shouldn't be shared. And finally, when I got to the point where I was like, let's say I have a daughter one day and she was in my situation, I wouldn't want her to feel like it wasn't bad enough to talk about. And I wouldn't want anyone else that went through something like me to feel like that,
Right.
because it matters no matter how little or how small it is, whether it was rape, molestation, emotional abuse, physical, it doesn't matter. It shouldn't happen. And it's important that we talk about it, because a lot of times the effects are the same or similar. Regardless of the extent, it affects the person a lot of
Yeah.
the same. And it's important to talk about, but the feeling is very normal, I think, of feeling like it wasn't a big deal, and honestly wanting to tell yourself that it wasn't a big deal. Because if it wasn't a big deal, I don't need to be
Yeah.
affected by it. If it wasn't a big deal, I can move on easier. So we kind of want to minimize it. And I think that's a very normal thing to feel. So if you are, on the fence about sharing your story, I also want to say, don't push yourself. Wait till you're fully comfortable. I was telling both of you I was going to do a podcast a while back, and I wasn't really ready yet. And I think you get a lot out of waiting until you are ready, not pushing yourself, going at your own pace, and then you can become more detailed as you become comfortable. But a lot of that is us trying to protect ourselves, and it's important. And we should wait until we're completely comfortable. And if you're never comfortable, if it's something you never want to talk about, that's valid too. Everyone's valid whether they want to talk about it a lot, a little, or not at all. And I think that's really important, because I think sometimes there's a lot of pressure. Like, the more stories we hear, the better it is for people that have been through it, and the more the church can kind of be called
Yeah.
out on it. So I think sometimes it can be a lot of pressure, when it's really important that everyone goes at their own pace.
Yeah.
And anyone that's thinking about sharing their story with you guys, I just want to say, I was really nervous, and they were great about sharing whatever I wanted, how little or how much, whatever pace I want. Anything I want can be edited out, which made me so much more comfortable. Very easy, very lax. So if that makes anyone else more comfortable, it has been a great experience, great for me, and very easy at my own pace.
Yeah, absolutely. We feel like there's power in telling your story and putting words to it. And I would say the majority of people that have been on our podcast have said the same thing, that they were hesitant at first to share their story because they thought maybe it wasn't enough. I said the same thing before I did my episode. I know Christina said the same thing. But then when we actually put it out there, and then when my girlfriend listened to it, she was like, "Oh my gosh." She's like, "You've been through so much." And I was like, "Really?" You're right.
Yeah, you
To
realize,
protect ourselves, we minimize it. But then if we look at it from a third person's perspective, from a third person, what they see, or like you said, what if this happened to my daughter? It's devastating,
Mm-hmm.
and trauma is trauma. It affects everyone differently, and there is no too little.
That's right.
Trauma's trauma. And so we really appreciate you and anyone that shares their story, because the more voices we have, the more that people will know that they're not alone.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
And honestly, if it weren't for other women sharing their stories, I would have continued to think that I was the outlier, the unique one, the only one it, had happened to. And it was because of other people being like, no, this happened to me, this happened to me. And I was like, wow, it's more out there than you think it is. And the more you feel that, the more you feel not as singled out, not like, well, what did I do to have this happen? Well, no, we're not all doing something to have it happen. It just is happening and being covered up. So it's part of that shame thing. It's less of the shame and stuff when you know that you're not the only one.
Yeah.
So.
It takes some of that shame away. I say it all the time. I'm a broken record about this, but I really do believe that a huge chunk of healing from anything is just to start with is simply knowing you are not alone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, I agree for sure. That's definitely a big one. Like, I've listened to a few of the episodes. I obviously want to listen to more. At first, I was afraid. I was telling Sarah, I was afraid to listen to them because I was afraid that the more I listened, the more I would feel like mine wasn't as bad or enough of a story, or it wasn't as big of a deal.
Right.
So I was afraid to listen to a lot because I felt like I'd minimize it more and then I would not want to share it more. So I didn't listen to that many because I know myself and I know that's kind of what would have happened. So I'm excited now that I have done mine. I can kind of listen to them. But I just want to reiterate the point that it doesn't matter how bad, how much, what type.
That's right.
Because I've had people say, well, I wouldn't have thought that was a big deal, or that wouldn't have been a big deal to me. If it's traumatic to you, it was trauma and it was traumatic. Just because somebody else would have brushed it off or it wouldn't have affected them doesn't mean it's not trauma and it wasn't traumatic and it wasn't abuse. So it doesn't matter if you felt it was traumatic or if it affected you, then it's important enough and it's a big enough deal, and you can talk about it if you want to when you're ready. And I think that's really important. I think this is a great platform and podcast for people to be able to share their stories their way without too much probing or pushing a narrative one way or the other way. Like, I was uncomfortable even if I should mention that I'm Christian now and my religion in the fact, because I know a lot of LDS people and probably a lot of your listeners aren't. But it's nice that it's kind of open to whatever religion you came from, wherever you're at now. I think that's a
Yeah.
great thing.
Thank you. And thank you for that and for trusting us with your story, because that's super, super important to us that people that are with us feel safe. It's big. It's really big.
Yeah, because there's so many times where more in writing, I think, than podcasts, but even interviews, you see where people like go to share their story about something and then they twist their words, or the
Mm-hmm.
questions are very leading to one way. So they make it seem very different. And that was my fear. I didn't want it to turn into this, she's against LDS or whatever way they wanted to lead it. I didn't want to be my words twisted anyway for anything that I didn't mean. And that's so easy to do today with technology and everything. I think everyone kind of fears that. So just to throw out there too, I don't know if your listeners know this, but I get to listen to it first before it's ever published, which to me was huge. The fact that I can say, "Ooh, I wish I wouldn't have said this. Can we edit this out?" That makes a huge difference because I know what everyone else is going to hear before they hear it, and that just made me so much more comfortable that I can change it and tweak it if needed, and that I don't have to then look back and be like, "Oh, I forgot I said that. I didn't know everyone was going to hear this," or anything like that. That was a big thing for me that helped.
Good. I'm glad.
Yeah. We definitely want our we definitely want our guests to feel safe and secure. And the whole purpose of us doing this podcast is for survivors to be able to tell their stories to other survivors in a way that they feel safe. So absolutely, that's definitely one of the reasons why we let the guests listen to it first. And sometimes we've even had guests that listen to it and then decide not to publish it at all, and that's okay too. Because there's healing just in telling the story. Taylor, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you guys both so much. It's been absolutely great. And if there's anything else, you need anything else, you have any more questions, definitely let me know.
Thank you for joining us on Latter-day Survivors. As survivors of trauma and abuse, we wanted to provide a platform for survivors to share their stories. Many survivors of all types of abuse may be able to recognize and relate to the patterns of behavior in the victims, abusers, families, and friends of the stories shared by other survivors on this podcast. Often, as we escape oppressive family, religious, and social constructs to a safer place where we come to see our abuse and all related issues, we are better able to process and begin to heal. We believe that when we share our stories with others, we can also help them to heal. It can take decades for survivors to find the courage to speak about these things. If it is so hard for adults, imagine how difficult it is for a child to speak up. We hope to normalize these discussions so that children can speak to adults earlier. As adults, we must listen and recognize the severity of the abuse, its potential consequences, and the need for action to stop the abuse as early as possible. Just knowing we are not alone, that there are other people who have felt and do feel the same or have endured similar experiences in life, can remind us that we are not alone in this.
I was born in rose-colored water. It seeped into my eyes and soul, and I didn't know the difference. Being blind was beautiful, but no amount of sweet addiction can stop the force of reality. In the bitter recognition, only you can set you free. I don't believe in saints, I don't believe in sinners. It's not black and white in life, it's like gray in the winter. And I don't believe in the kind of love I used to anymore. I jumped ship and I still got my middle fingers pointed from the shore. And it was worth it. If anyone wants to know, it was worth it. Let me reap what I sow. My mother's blood runs through my veins. We haven't spoken years. If we did, maybe I'd ask, what's it like to become your worst fear? And there's two sides to every story, carved by pain and memory. Time will soften all the edges, but it's still stone I keep with me. I don't believe in saints, I don't believe in sinners. It's not black and white in life, it's like gray in the winter. And I don't believe in the kind of love I used to anymore. I jumped ship and I still got my middle fingers pointed from the shore. And it was worth it. If anyone wants to know,